First of all, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to be in Zurich. If I upset some people today, please do not accept my apologies. I have every intention of upsetting some people. What I want to do is to look at the issue of between Agile and agility. And one of the things I want to say up front is one of the basically misconceptions of people in the Agile community at the moment is that they're somehow or other more agile than people in the rest of the business. And if only the rest of the business adopted Scrum, then magically everything would be solved, right? Now, this is actually deeply problematic. And I'm going to go through some of the reasons for that in a minute. I've worked at C-level in organizations like IBM. Corporate strategy leaves Agile developers standing when it comes to actually dynamics and agility. Yeah? And confining corporate strategy to 2-week sprints is actually a disaster waiting to happen, which doesn't mean that we don't need agility per se. Right? So I want to go through some of the reasons. I think we also need to get honest about where we are with Agile. Agile at the moment is coming to the end of its life cycle. And I'm going to go through some of the reasons for that in a minute. You can see it with the consolidation of things like SAFe, which is the opposite of what agility was meant to be about in the first place. Yeah, effectively, it's kind of like, I'm not sure whether it's a wolf in sheep's clothing, but that's what it feels like to me. But that's a classic end of life cycle phenomenon. When a novel idea hasn't taken off, people effectively conform it to orthodoxy to make it fit. And then they claim they've done something. Right? Now, it doesn't mean there isn't a lot to come here, and I want to build onto some new methods and techniques as we go through. But let's start with a statement by one of the Agile Manifesto founders. He's written a series of blogs where he's basically saying that Agile has become industrialized, it's become weaponized, it's lost a lot of the original vision. 2 days ago, Ron Jeffries, who competes with me to be the most curmudgeonly speaker on the circuit, it's an ongoing competition for cynicism, he's winning at the moment, but I intend to up my game, basically wrote an all-out attack on modern Agile as betraying every single principle of the original Agile Manifesto. Yeah, the irony is one of the principles is to put people before process and tools, but actually Agile is defined by process and tools, not by people and needs. Yeah, really these days Agile is defined by method wars and tool wars between Scrum, between Kanban, between LESS, between SAFe, with certification and accreditation the only thing which actually seems to count. Yeah? And that's a betrayal of the original principles. As Ron quite rightly points out, Agile was meant to be about freeing programmers to do good work, not about freeing IT directors to say they've become Agile by launching an initiative which will actually not be over until they've left and done the same thing at another company. That is a very common phenomenon, by the way. Yeah? One of the things that you see frequently in organizations is an executive comes in, announces a major new initiative, claims how successful it would be, spend millions of dollars on it, and leaves before the rollout is complete to repeat the same exercise. And organizations daren't admit that the initiative failed because they've spent so much money on it. Yeah? And actually there's a lot of Agile initiatives at the moment where we know companies have abandoned, but nobody is talking about it because it's mud all over their faces, to use a British expression. So we need to be aware of the sort of, that sort of aspect of it. And if you really want proof that Agile has come to the end of its life cycle, it's that McKinsey's are now adopting it. The other prediction of the end of a life cycle, by the way, is that IBM Global Services adopts something as a strategic approach. We can see that with design thinking at the moment, all right? Which again is very much at the end of its life cycle. Can talk about that after the break if anybody wants. So basically what we're now seeing is the big consultancies are wrapping up basically collections of Agile statements, 5 of these, 3 of these, into the classic consultancy formulaic approaches. Because big management consultancies rely on high utilization for large teams. The last thing they want is small dynamic teams on short-term engagements, and kind of like you can see that coming through. At the moment, all of them are acquiring Agile brand names at ridiculous price-earnings ratios. Those prices won't be around for more than about another year. Because once each of the big 6 has acquired a company with an Agile brand, they've now got the label, and they'll move on, and then the small guys will get squeezed. So those of you in small Agile consultancy groups, just get ready for a big squeeze because you ain't got the account management capability of the big guys, and they're moving in on a space through corporate procurement, and you're going to have to do something different. And I'll talk about what the different thing is in a minute or two. So I'm trying to be optimistic as well as pessimistic, but the combination of the two is called realism, right? And Agile is pervaded by idealists who actually do not connect with reality on a regular basis. It's kind of like all about, wouldn't it be wonderful if, and if only everybody adopted these principles, life would be wonderful. Well, kind of like you wouldn't do that with your kids, so please don't try and do it with employees and users. Yeah? Another one, this is actually a really important thing, and this is always one of my concerns when Agile started to be associated with Scrum and then with Kanban, which are useful tools or methods within the spectrum, but shouldn't encompass the totality. And this from a Google engineer, and this is a really important point. Agile methods work short life cycle, high customer interaction, front-end type stuff where people know what they want. They're really poor at long-term infrastructure projects or the area I work where we're developing stuff that people don't know what they need yet. Yeah, and that's what I've done all my life. And that's what we call managing for unarticulated needs, which is where innovation happens. If you're managing for unarticulated needs, you need a different type of approach. Again, I'll talk about some of that later. Yeah? When I was first in IT, which is more years ago than I care to remember, I remember being taught punch card machines at school. Anybody else remember punch cards? Yeah, you had real discipline if you learnt on punch card machines. Compile error card 3, you learnt to think ahead, right? And we were told we'd have a job for life if we could operate a punch card machine. Yeah? The modern equivalent in schools is teaching kids to code in things like Java. Yeah, by the time they graduate, all of that stuff will be done by AI bots anyway. And we should be teaching them things like anthropology and design, which actually will persist as values downstream. Yeah, there's some dangers on this in terms of where we're developing things. So the danger is we started to get obsessed with one method or tool. Nobody should call Scrum a framework. It isn't a framework. It's a series of methods, and that's very different. Yeah? Because it's one approach. It's a one-size-fits-all. And actually, it should be a one-size-fits-certain contexts, yeah, in terms of the way things work. And I'll use Kinevin to show that later. But what I want to do is to start off by talking about life cycle theory. Now, I'm going to do this because it's important to understand where Agile is at the moment. But everything I'm going to talk about now applies to selling a new idea into a company as well. Yeah, you have to be aware of the life cycle of adoption of novelty. There are times when people are open to novel things, and there are times when they're not. And actually advocating novelty during one of the stable times is just a recipe for disaster. It's not the way to work. Yeah? So what I want to do here is introduce the concept of an apex predator. That's a wolf, a timber wolf from California. Yeah? You may or may not have heard of trophic cascades, but what actually happens is if you remove the apex predator from an ecosystem, so wolves were hunted to death in Yellowstone National Park and in the UK. You remove the apex predator, it means the level below doesn't get predated anymore. In this case, deer. So deer graze everything, including riverbanks, which means earth crumbles into rivers, rivers become polluted and silted up. And that's called a trophic cascade. Yet removal of the apex predator has catastrophic effects on the ecosystem as a whole. There's some Gaia theorists feel if we were removed as a species, it might have the opposite effect. But I don't want to wait for the experimental evidence on that, but I have got some sympathy with it. Right? It's quite interesting. For some reason, people won't allow us to reintroduce wolves into Scotland, although human beings are at no real danger from European wolves. Yeah? So we've actually reintroduced lynx, for example, in Northumberland and beaver, and that's already having a major positive effect on the ecosystem. Reintroducing one pack into wolves in Yellowstone, within a couple of years, the rivers ran clean again. Now, the apex predator is important because actually, as long as the ecosystem is stable, the ecosystem organizes around the apex predator and they survive no matter how incompetent they are. Yeah? This is really important to understand. Yeah? When the ecosystem changes, the apex predator can't survive anymore because they're over-optimized. So when the meteor wipes out, the dinosaurs, on that point, if you had to predict who would be the next apex predator, you'd probably go for the shark or the crocodile, both of which survive. you wouldn't go for the first proto-mammal. But actually, that is small, highly energy efficient and adaptive, so it moves into the ecosystem and then becomes dominant. Yeah? So when an ecology gets radically disrupted, it's something small and unexpected which is able to adapt very quickly, which becomes the next apex predator. You should start to see where I'm going on strategy with this now. So let me draw a picture. Yeah? So you should all be familiar with life cycle theory. If you're not familiar with life cycle theory, then go and do some reading. So basically, it's basically drawn like this. Well, if you want to be IT professionals and you don't understand 101 strategy, I've got fed up to the back teeth of Agile people who say they can move Agile into strategy and haven't read even 101 books on corporate strategy. They just think they can move across. Yeah? It's a complex area. So basically, on life cycle theory, and this varies, but this is my version. This is what are called early adopters. That's 2.5% of the total market. Now, there's always somebody who wants to buy something new. Yeah? And what's interesting is what these guys do is they buy how it does it, not what it does. Yeah, I'm in my third software startup now, right? First for myself, 2 previously in companies. The first we did on logistics. So this was, you might remember a few decades ago, well, not some of you are too young for this, but basically manufacturing spare parts were ordered. They had 2 big bins, and they filled them both up. And the minute one emptied, they filled it up again. That was the entire ordering mechanism. I mean, some of them were big virtual bins on computers. And I wouldn't be here today if we won a contract with British Aerospace. And they didn't want to pay $250,000 for the license fee, because what we did was to measure forecast accuracy and dynamically adjust buffer stock based on forecast accuracy and lead time. Yeah, and that's just standard now, but it was revolutionary when we first did it. And they wouldn't pay $250,000, so I offered them 0.01% of their audited stock savings per annum for the next 5 years and no license fee. They said they wanted to go along with it, and a few days before they signed the contract, some bastard of an accountant checked the numbers, and they came back and said, we'll pay $250,000. My bonus alone in year 1 would have allowed me to retire if they'd accepted that because of the amount of wastage, right? Now, what's fascinating then is we sold that software to British Aerospace, NATO, Coca-Cola, Schweppes, and I've forgotten the other one. Yeah, Gateway Food Markets. So FMCG and spare parts. When you're selling something to new, industry doesn't matter. As things mature, they specialize by industry sector. It's kind of like a big mistake consultancies do. When you're doing something new, you're generalists. As the system matures, you need to become a specialist. Yeah? So basically, whenever we went to meet these guys, I remember in Luxembourg with NAMSA, the Arms Supply Agency for NATO, they wanted to argue about the algorithms we used. They actually were quite pleased when the software didn't work, because then they could get into the code and get into the algorithms and say how they could do it better. Techies are like this. If you ever build an object library, don't give them access to source code. I learned that the hard way. If you give them access to source code, they can always find a way that the object can be improved, and you get no control and no version control. Yeah? I mean, I know we've moved on a bit from that now, but that's a memory. So basically, these guys, effectively, they're the enthusiasts. They're the people who buy a car, not to drive it, but to take it apart and rebuild it with other parts. You know those guys? As opposed to those of us who get in a car and just wanted to take us somewhere with minimal interference. Yeah? After you go through that period, you get what is called the early majority. This is 13.5% of the total market. So these guys buy how? These guys buy what? What will it do for me? And they want first mover advantage. They don't want lots of other people to have done it before, but they trust you to deliver. You've proved you can deliver something, that's cool. What they want to know is what it will do for me and how fast can it do it. And a lot of software companies actually don't make that transition. They keep selling how rather than selling what. I've seen this with Kanban guys. They're so enthusiastic about their software, they lose sight of what it's meant to do. Yeah, because the tool becomes all pervasive, and that's why you get a problem. You then get late majority. Various figures on this, all right, but it's kind of like the bulk of the system. And this is where people buy basically what other people are doing. This is where you make big money on markets. And the key thing is, if you actually dominate the market there, that first period, then you can control the next market because you're the apex predator. So the person who comes out of that 13.5% on top is then the apex predator thereafter. And then we get the final group down here. These are really sad people who only buy things when everybody else realizes the thing has reached the end of the life cycle, right? This is actually government at the moment. If you don't know, the big consultancy firms actually teach this on their courses. When you can't sell it to industry anymore because you know it doesn't work, go and sell it to government as industrial best practice and you'll get another 10 years. Yeah? And actually, although I am being cynical, I am being factual. That is what they actually do. And they put the lower grade consultants on that because it's an end of life cycle strategy. It's why we're seeing Lean Six Sigma, which is a contradiction in terms anyway. Lean is about eliminating the waste of things like Six Sigma created in the first place. Extensively being adopted in government, being largely abandoned these days in industry. Yeah? So, that's kind of like life cycle. Now, a guy called Geoffrey Moore, if you haven't read Crossing the Chasm, it's a really easy read, certainly for somebody from a technology background. Said actually, what actually happens here is that this becomes a chasm. So people project sales as going like that. They don't. There's this period where nobody buys for a bit because the market is going from a phase shift from early adopters to early majority, from how it does it to what it will do for me. And people don't make that transition. First of all, they get their sales and marketing wrong, but they don't recognize there's going to be a gap. In software, my old rule on this is you sell to make in the first stage, and then you switch to make to sell. So you actually bring investment in here, not here. Yeah? Because basically, if you can't sell it to somebody who will let you make it after they've, but yeah, you're not in the right cycle at that point. So sell to make to sell. And that transition isn't done. So what I did many years ago, and this was part of the turnaround of data sciences, by then I was in charge of strategy, and this is the thing IBM bought us for when they created global services. So data sciences, which was Anglo-Dutch, became the foundation acquisition from which IBM built IBM Global Services. Yeah? So basically, what I did was to combine that with SCurves. You've probably all seen SCurves. So what happens, something completely novel comes in, it's exciting, it goes into the chasm. If it comes out of that, it becomes dominant, and then it dies. So it's like a natural cycle. This is not the Gartner hype curve, but some of the same concepts behind that. And my bit of originality on this was to say what actually happens is that the reason for the chasm is the previous idea is coming to the end of its life cycle. So what you've actually got is the previous idea is reaching the end, kind of like it's not working so well, people have reached the limits of what it can do. Business process re-engineering was extremely useful in the 80s and 90s, but then people took it too far. Yeah, so we got a high amount of utility from it, but then we took it too far. We tried to apply it to everything. Kanban is a really useful technique. Personal Kanban is an issue for some individuals, but not for most. Yet you take it too far. Yeah? So what actually happens, and you see this cycle frequently, is it gradually gets to the point, and we now have two key decision points. This one I'm going to come back to in a minute. This is a moment of choice. And this is what is called competence-induced failure. This is Clayton Christensen's point. Yeah? The reason companies fail is not because they're poor, but it's because they're too good at the old paradigm. If you want a key phrase for this, it's called the Kodak moment. Yeah, Kodak created digital photography, but they weren't prepared to give up the revenue of film. Yeah, so they lost out completely because somebody else moved into that space. Yeah, and we can see other examples in the modern day. So these two inflection points become absolutely vital. You don't need to be agile here. You need to be agile here and here. Now, this is going to be a key message, and it's always been the message of things like the Canadian framework. A British phrase, horses for courses. Yeah, which racing horse you bet on depends on the weather conditions. Yeah, some horses run better on wet ground, some on dry ground. Yeah, you need to understand the context before you place a bet. There isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. Yeah? So we need to understand the context in the way things work. The other thing is this is actually quite a small lifespan. If you don't recognize it here, you end up going down there. Now, sometimes you recover, sometimes you die. So let me give you a simple illustration. It's on a big scale on technology. 1920s, IBM entered the emerging field of computing. They repurposed punch card technology used to control sewing machines. Now, this is actually really important. They repurposed an existing technology for something completely novel. In biology, that's called exaptation. Yeah, so the cerebellum at the base of your brains evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers. Under conditions of stress in humans, it exapted to create human grammar. The huge sophistication of grammar in language couldn't happen in a linear way. It required a non-linear switch. Feathers evolved in dinosaurs for sexual display. They exapted for flight. 1940s, a Raytheon engineer maintaining the magneto of a radar machine noticed that a chocolate bar melted in their pocket. Well, lots of people had noticed that and they just sworn and had their trousers cleaned. He realized the significance and we got microwave ovens. The whole of the pharmaceutical industry relies on people spotting side effects, not on designed impact. Yeah, radical repurposing is a key strategic agility, and most current agile methods prevent it. That's why I'm talking about unarticulated needs, and I'll come back to that at the end. Right? So basically, they repurposed punch card technology. That gave them first mover advantage. Throughout the 80s, it didn't matter if you had better kit. Yeah, VAX clusters were a damn sight better than anything IBM produced on Systems 36, or God help us, AS400. Yeah, but those are the things that people bought. DEC Alpha was a brilliant piece of hardware, but it got wiped out by the IBM PC, which was pathetic. Yeah, and the point is, people bought the apex predator. They bought the dominant person in play. People don't buy the best solution, they buy the safest solution. Now, something really important to understand about corporate purchasing, they buy the safest solution, not the best solution. And remember, after IBM taught us, I had to go and talk to all of them about why we never bought IBM kit. We were a systems integrator. They said we had the best kit. I said it was irrelevant. We're a systems integrator. We know that actually the speed of a processor is a very, very small part of the totality of the process. Yeah? This other supplier guarantees they'll upgrade our processors if we have a performance problem. They've removed risk. You won't do that. These guys put somebody in our library to write the technical specs for us, provided we bid their kit. That cuts out $1 billion of bid cost every 5 years. We work with them. And they said, but we produced the better kit. And they just hadn't understood the totality of the decision. Yeah? People don't listen. They sell, but they don't listen. Right? And that's kind of the key thing on this. Either way, so that's what IBM does, kind of like until the 80s, kind of like nobody gets fired for buying IBM. The trouble is, they're protected from the growing commodification of hardware. Hardware becomes cheaper and cheaper. Because IBM is the apex predator, they don't face the price pressure their competitors face, so they don't see the collapse coming. And when the collapse comes, they almost went bankrupt. Competence-induced failure again. Yeah? And the next apex predator is Microsoft. Because the value change has gone from hardware, which is a commodity, to software, which is value. And remember, IBM paid Bill Gates to steal somebody else's software to create an operating system, and then he repurposed it to create Windows. You see the repurposing again? Nobody starts from scratch. They exploit something for something somebody else hasn't realized it can do. IBM gave the IP for Windows to Bill Gates because they didn't think software mattered that much. And when they tried to enter it with OS, they just didn't get anywhere. It was too late. And then, of course, nobody gets fired for buying Windows. Despite the fact that it's an appalling piece of software, I really feel sorry for people who have to use it. All right, sorry, this is an Apple boy speaking. All right? You know, corporates roll it out, it becomes a standard approach, and of course, guess what? Software starts to become a commodity, remember that? Open source, Red Hat, all these sort of things. Microsoft are protected from that, so they don't see it coming, and then guess who comes next? Apple. because Apple realized that people couldn't care less about hardware and software. That's only something techies worry about. Yeah? Techies really like open systems because it's a job creation scheme. Yeah, think about that one, all right? Most users just want, this is a lovely phrase from anthropology, objects of material desire. What Apple realized is people want something beautiful which does something they didn't know they needed, but now they need desperately. Yeah? And actually, hardware and software are irrelevant because it's easier to develop beautiful things quickly if you don't have to have open systems. So they close the ecosystem because they realize that's where the value is. And guess what happened to Microsoft? They're now copying Apple. That's what they're doing with Surface. That's one of the indicators. You see the pattern? Yeah? What comes next is an open question, but those are examples of cycles. Yeah? And my argument is Agile's going through the same thing, and we need to pay attention to it, because everything we can see at the moment says that really, to be honest, we're somewhere around here. High levels of commodification, yeah, which means we need to start to look at what the next set of things are. And that requires a different sort of approach in terms of the way we work. So if I stop every now and then, it's because I need to take a picture of that, so you got it later. Okay, so let's look at some statistics in this concept. And now I want to talk about the concept of resilience. And a lot of people get resilience wrong. So there being a big difference between resilience and robustness. So robustness is a system that survives without fracture, without change. So if you want a metaphor for this, think about a seawall. You've got a massive concrete wall which is stopping the sea inundating lowlands. Yeah? That's something which is robust. Yeah, it's defined, it's fixed, we know what it is. It means we can drain the land, on the landward side, we can use that for agriculture. And it's brilliant until its design conditions are exceeded, at which point it breaks catastrophically. It would be better if it hadn't been there in the first place. Yeah? But until you reach that limit, it's really very good. Now, a resilient system, on the other hand, is a salt marsh. A salt marsh absorbs a huge amount of flood water, continues to hold that water even after it's reached saturation level, and is an adaptive system. Yeah? A resilient system survives by changing in context, but with continuity over time. The whole point about resilience is change with continuity. Yeah? And that requires flexible approaches. Yeah? The biggest challenge, and I'll just put this as a marker, this is something I'm going to be starting to talk about later on this year, the biggest challenge at the moment is to radically rethink architecture in business and software. Yeah, we just ain't got the architecture right. We're still drawing plumbing diagrams and saying they're architectural diagrams, and those aren't. Yeah, we need to switch away from an engineering metaphor, but I'll just park that for the moment. Now, another way to understand this is to think about distributions. If I look at measuring risk, basically most people use one of these things called a bell curve. All God's children love bell curves. Yeah? And the whole point about a bell curve is it's really nice because you can say this stuff we can just ignore because it's low probability. Right? Everything in the middle is cool. So provided we covered off everything in the middle of the bell curve, we've done all that can be reasonably expected of us. Search algorithms work on this, market research works on it, yeah, risk management works on this, everything works on this. The trouble is that's one type of a distribution, it's a type of Gaussian distribution. If I do a double log scale of size against frequency, I get a pattern like this, which means I can draw a straight line through it like that, which is called a power law. It's not straight there. One of the leading experts on the way by this is Didier, just down the road at the University of Zurich, easily one of the leading experts. So there are a lot of small software errors, a small number of large software errors. A lot of small floods, small number of large floods, all right? Double log frequency, size against frequency, you get that straight line called a power law. If I overlay one on the other, I get this. I've now got a massive tail. Which actually means, and this is a scary thing, this is why companies don't like Pareto curves, it means failure is inevitable. You can't prevent it. One of the biggest problems facing healthcare at the moment is the belief we can have a system which can't fail. That is actually increasing the failure rate. We just completed a big study in the northeast of England looking at police firearms squads, fire officers and ambulance people, the main cause of stress, of breakdown, is the health and safety rules. It's not the job. And they're trying to plug the gap with a meaningful bunch of 2-day courses on mindfulness, and you can't replicate 20 years of learning how to do meditation in a 2-day meditation class. Yeah? But it's a nice little palliative to patch over the fact the deeper problem is an over-regulated system that doesn't allow for variation. I'll give you the one example on that. A fire officer in tears, they arrived at a frozen pond in winter. A kid had gone in to rescue his dog, which had gone through the ice. They were forced to spend 2 minutes doing a safety assessment before they did anything, and to call out an additional vehicle, and the kid died while that was going on, and the guy can't live with himself anymore because he realized he should have broken the rules. Yeah? Nurses in British hospitals have to break the rules on a daily basis to provide empathetic care, and that's what's causing the stress, is an over-constrained system, and palliative stickers ain't going to work to actually make a change. Yeah? So the problem is, what we need here is fast detection, fast recovery. Now that's a really important principle, because you completely change your scanning system if you open up for that. Yeah, there's all sorts of implications for software development and safety testing as well on this. All right? What matters is you fail very fast in large volume very quickly, or you anticipate that failure. And if you don't know it, human beings learn more from failure than success. Now, sidebar here, how many people have got children? Okay, do you tell them stories about how Janet and John stayed at home, did what mummy and daddy said, achieved their family key performance indicators, and followed the family value system? Does anybody do that? Yeah? Or do you tell them stories about how Janet and John went into the woods despite mummy's and daddy's best advice, and met evil witches, terrible wolves, safe practitioners, and other desians of evil, all right? But luckily, at the end of the day, we save them because we want them to sleep at night, all right? We teach our children through stories of failure, not stories of success. We run strategic training for managers now, in which teams in parallel over 3 successive rounds, all they can then do is fail. The games team doesn't allow them to succeed. I'm a Star Trek fan, you know where I got the idea from. By the end of it, we experiments with the Singapore Army, yeah? We can actually increase the scanning range by a factor of over 25 after 3 rounds. Multiple failure increases the amount of things you take into account before you make a decision. Being trained in games to succeed actually reduces what you take into account. It increases complacency. Yeah, avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. And we now build worst practice systems for companies, not best practice systems, because worst practice systems have higher utility. Yeah? And that's all this part of recognizing. Resilience needs to recognize that failure is part of life and learn to live with it. So to simplify this, this point here is where I have a many-to-many relationship between the past and the present. It's this point here, where the power law doesn't apply. So I've got a symmetric relationship between what happened in the past and what can happen in the future, which means I can actually forecast what will happen by projecting what happened in the past. Yeah, that's called forecasting in that sense. Yeah? So here, I can deal with anything which is probable, and I can forecast. Here, it gets more difficult. What I've now got is increasing asymmetry between what happened in the past and what will happen in the future. So increasingly, things happen in the future which have never happened before, or in variations of the past which cause strategic surprise in unexpected ways. Yeah? But I have got a past-to-future relationship, so that's actually quite valuable. So here, I deal with anything which is possible. And this is where we do things like scenario planning, cone of possibilities, risk analysis, all of those things where we use our knowledge of the past and our hypotheses about the future to constrain risk. All that's good. The trouble is, over here, I have to deal with anything which is plausible. And of course, probable, possible, plausible is an exponential increase in number of things I've got to handle. Yeah? So I've now got massive asymmetry, I've got constant novelty. And actually, the more I use the past to filter the future, the more risky the situation is. So up till this point, I can use the past. From this point onwards, I mustn't use it. Because it means we'll only do what we expect to see. We've got a project in the Valley at the moment in California called the Little Miss Sunshine Project. Everybody seen the film Little Miss Sunshine? I got told off by some people in California. They said it was a sexist film, and I thought, you guys really don't get irony, do you? Right? If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. Right? It was a left-field film. Coen Brothers, but low-budget movie, became a blockbuster. All right, the trouble is, film moguls always fund what was successful last time. They don't see novelty. That's the problem we got in Silicon Valley. They're funding things like the things which worked before, so they're not spotting novelty. And the way you spot novelty, and this is kind of like a point I'm not going to have time to go into at much depth, yeah? But what you have to have here is what's called a non-hypothesis approach. Okay? In logic terms, it's called abductive logic. Now, that's of major importance. Yeah? What I've shown you there as well, by the way, is this point here is the trigger point on the previous model. When distribution moves from Gaussian to Pareto, you know you're moving into what will be a potential phase shift in the system, so you can trigger a different mechanism. If you enter that point, you create lots of small businesses expecting them to fail and protect them from the main core business. That's what you do in strategic terms. Well, you carry on doing the main thing in the same way. And by the way, that's important because agility is needed there. It's not needed in day-to-day business. Yeah, trying to make everything agile is as much a mistake as making nothing agile in that sense. So, that leads me on to this key principle, yeah, and this underpins everything that we do, is that if you can't use effectively the past to determine the future, it means you can't use cases. And if you can't use cases, that undermines virtually every management textbook or every approach, or anybody who says they're empirical, they just do what worked for them last time. Yeah, that's actually a recipe for disaster. It's kind of like the burning embers type thing. So a couple of reasons why this is a problem. First of all, you can't trust what people say. We did a lot of this in IBM. This was a time of knowledge management, and people would go and interview chief knowledge officers and ask them how knowledge management was working in their company, and they believed them. We sent ethnographers in to discover how people actually worked. Yeah, and what we found is that nobody used the knowledge management systems except to find the name of the author of a document so they could phone that person up and have a conversation. Nobody used the system for any other purpose. But the chief knowledge officers claimed it was a success. If you do ethnography in agile communities, you'll find some complete nonsense. My favorite one is Telstra. You didn't get promoted unless you were agile, because agile was the latest thing, and they had waterfall projects. So they created one-year sprints. I thought that was brilliant. Yeah? Basically, instead of recognizing that some things work in some contexts and other things work in others, we tried to force a universal based on an ideal. We tried to manage in the center of a normal distribution, which is the problem with nearly every single agile method. It focuses on the center of a normal distribution rather than recognizing that these days lots of things happen in the tails. Yeah? And that's kind of like a problem with that sort of approach. So we've got a real problem. The way people responsible for things report what happens isn't the way they actually happen. And the other really scary thing, by the way, is the way people report things when they do them is not the way they report it a day later after they thought about it. Yeah, human memory is fundamentally faulty unless you capture it in the field under fire. Yeah, there's all sorts of cognitive neuroscience reasons for that, but you can't trust what people say. So if anybody goes you into a retrospective lessons learned process, you've got a real problem. Because human memory adjusts the past to meet the political needs of the present. And if you tell people to be honest, and you're a trusting culture, and you're a no-blame culture, and it's okay for everybody to be... You all heard those phrases? Yeah, an agile culture is a no-blame culture. Everybody is open, they admit their mistakes. All right? That is a Darwinian technique to eliminate the fatally naive early on in their career. Nobody in their right mind believes that. Have you ever been in one of these workshops led by a new age fluffy bunny facilitator, where you're asked to admit your biggest failure to show your trust in the group? It's up there with falling backwards off brick walls into the arms of your colleagues, something I will only do in front of named witnesses with video evidence of what happened afterwards. We've all got a very carefully rehearsed story of failure, which shows really how good we were. We don't share the real failure. All of these things get heavily gained, right? There's a whole body of facilitation techniques we go from this. Memory changes to meet it. We did this with IBM outsourcing contracts. We did lessons learned process the day before people knew whether they'd won or lost a contract, and the day afterwards, using a script with no variation. You thought you were talking about completely different histories. How people remembered things before they knew the outcome was highly contingent, had lots of data in it. If they succeeded, then they remembered everything as a logical, ordered process based on rational actions, and that was being embedded in the methods. If they failed, it was somebody else's fault or it was accidental. You all know the way this goes. And by the way, that was a big project which we ran for years. We ended up, every successful team was disbanded and broken up into other teams because success bred complacency, and unsuccessful teams, if they didn't make any excuses, were kept together because they always succeeded the next time. If they made excuses, they were fired. And that really upset people in the States because they couldn't get the concept. If they were successful, they would carry on being successful. And that was kind of like the engineering mentality rather than the cognitive mentality. Yeah, there's kind of like a paradox in my saying that. Next thing, Cobra Effect, Butterfly, and Hawthorne Effect. Cobra Effect, the English in India, sorry, I'm Welsh, all right? When we say English and when we say British has major cultural significance, all right? Yeah, this is the English in India, right? They decided there were too many cobras. So they announced a ₹1 reward for every cobra brought into the district commissioner. That produced a lot of dead cobras for a period of time until people realized how much money there was to be had in breeding cobras. Cobra farms sprung up all over India. If you want to see a metaphor for this for the agile training industry, feel free, because it's what I'm implying. Until basically the English realized what was going on, so they cancelled the reward, at which point the cobras were released into the wild, and there were more cobras rather than less. Human beings respond to explicit goals by rebadging whatever they were going to do anyway. Human beings are crafty gamers of formal systems. One of the things you learn pretty fast as a senior executive is not to be transparent and not to be explicit, because anything explicit will be gained, and excessive transparency destroys innovation. No transparency produces corruption. Excessive transparency destroys innovation because it doesn't give people space to experiment. Everything is observed. Yeah, these are just basic 101 cognitive neuroscience facts. Butterfly effect, so I've gone on too far. This is the famous butterfly that flaps its wings in the Amazonian rainforest and is held to cause a hurricane in Texas. Well, it doesn't. I mean, I know Texans. If butterflies were causing hurricanes, by now they'd have been subject to, vigilante with extreme action involving guns, or possibly worse, a visit by Donald Trump or some other variation on that fact. Basically, something very small, uniquely on this occasion, combines with other small things to produce a hurricane, but it doesn't mean it will do it next time. I've lost count of the number of agile formal methodologies which are based on people's partial memory of 2 or 3 cases which they then formalize. Yeah? That, in scientific terms, to be quite honest, is not only pathetic, it's dishonest. Yeah? You might well have a butterfly effect. It worked for you that time because of a unique combination. It ain't going to work again. Yeah? And Hawthorne effect, I'm very sorry, this is from many studies. This was done actually in New York in the 1920s. They increased lighting level in a cable manufacturer, and people became more productive. Now, these days, in the Agile community, they would now publish a book called Light, The Secret to Productivity, and dine out on the conference circuit and create a certification program. Then they had some pretension to be real scientists, so they lowered the lighting level, and people became more productive. And they weren't expecting that. It's rather like Lean Startup, if anybody's read that. Okay, so he goes and studies a group of his friends who think they've been successful and listens to what they say and creates a recipe from it. With Dorothy Leonard, we studied that years before he went there. We studied the companies who failed, as well as the companies who succeeded. They all did exactly the same things as the companies who succeeded. It's yes, you're dealing with a market, so a certain number are bound to succeed. And again, people don't know the basis of science. They get this sort of stuff wrong. Yeah? So the trouble with Hawthorne Effect is if you do something novel, it will work. And that's the trouble. People start an Agile initiative, it's novel, it works, but it doesn't scale and it doesn't sustain because you've got a Hawthorne Effect. Right? So there's a major issues with cases. Next one, confusing correlation with causation. This is a massive problem. People go and study 10 or 15 cases, and from that they do correlations and say, if you do things that these guys did, you too will be successful. Everybody familiar with that approach? 95% of management textbooks do it. The really bad ones, though, for example, reinventing the organization, doesn't even do that. It has a hypothesis, and it goes to find aspects of cases which support the hypothesis and ignores the one which challenge it. Yeah, the failures of holacracy are legion, but they don't report any of that. He just reports the aspects which are succeeding. And of course, believe it or not, he's a consultant in holacracy, but don't take me there, right? It's charlatanism. Right? So basically, confusing correlation with causation. If Switzerland wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes per head of population, and this is going to be easy in Switzerland, all you have to do is increase the consumption of dark chocolate. Dark chocolate consumption directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population over the last several decades. It's an obvious solution. Why don't you go and do it? If you don't know it, suicides by drowning directly correlate with the release of Nicolas Cage movies, but I can see a reason for that, so that may be a more causal link. Correlation is a dangerous thing. Yeah? And finally, massive confirmation bias. Again, the trouble with most Agile methodologies is people are looking for aspects of cases to support what they already believe. That's not a research mentality, and it's actually a very dangerous one. You only see what you expect to see, and the real killer punch on this is very simple. If you take radiologists and you give them a batch of X-rays, radiologists are facing far more limited information than strategists face. And on one of the X-rays, the final X-ray, you've put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% don't see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83%. You only scan 2 or 3% of what is front of you, and you privilege their most recent experiences. And you can't not do that. And by the way, that bit of research kills off all concepts that systems analysts can find out what users need. Yeah? You only see what you expect to see. And there are sound evolutionary reasons for that. Think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. If something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed, do you want to autistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and then pay to attend a 2-day certification course on how to avoid lions? Yeah? By that time, the only document you're used to will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only case study I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore, written by a survivor. Yeah, we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data scans, privilege on our most recent experiences. Yeah? Now, these are just hard facts. And the key is to devise methods and tools which recognize those facts rather than try and pretend they don't. So, let me move on. A couple of bits of science quickly. This is actually really important. Now, that's a couple of phrases here. Interactions matter more than things. This comes out of complexity science. How things interact with each other matters far more than what they are. That has major implications for HR, by the way. People keep trying to create ideal leaders or ideal employees, or they talk about things like an agile mindset. I blogged on that somewhat satirically 2 days ago, right? A mindset, I compared it with the miasma theory in the days of the plague. People assumed that somehow or other, there was contagion in bad smells, so they wore masks. And the discomfort of the masks probably disguised the fact they wouldn't be bitten by fleas, which was actually causing the infection. Yeah? Culture arises from multiple small actions over time. It can't be devised or can't be defined. It's the way you behave which actually allows culture to emerge. Yeah? It's a really important principle. You can't design a culture, and 101 anthropology, if you write your values down, you just lost them. Because everybody now knows how to say, or what language to use. You've displayed the language of power. In anthropology, real values are unstated and non-explicit, but they're understood. If you make them explicit, they'll be gained. No? Now, the other point on this, and this is of critical importance, is epigenetics as well, is tools change people's cognitive capability. It's why putting people in cubicles actually damages them mentally as well as reducing their productivity. Because human beings aren't automated, we require more stimulus. If you don't know it, you shouldn't let kids under the age of 5 have more than about half an hour a day on a computer screen, because the level of stimulus they get from a computer screen will activate the genes which are predisposed to autism. You're reducing their stimulation to a very limited form. If you don't know it, scent is critical for human beings to assess trust. Yeah, the external world is part of our distributed consciousness. Yeah? So there's a lot of stuff we're learning which is quite scary, but it means tool design is more important because people are changed by their tools. And they're changed within a single lifetime. Yeah? So tool design is critical. And that leads me basically onto complexity. And that's what I want to pull stuff together with and finish. Right? So basically, this is from Brian Arthur. Complexity is about systems in which there are so many interacting elements that you are dealing with constant novelty. So this is why it's appropriate during those positions of change. But the rules for complexity are different. So what I'll briefly do, is draw Cynefin, and then kind of like come through principles. How many people have seen Cynefin? Yeah, most. Okay. You don't have to indulge in the drinking game because I'm here. If I'm here, the drinking game doesn't apply, all right? Okay, so Cynefin looks like this. It identifies 5 domains. This domain here, called disorder, is a domain of not knowing what type of system you're in. That's where you're uncertain. That's kind of like a starting point. You then have the domain where things are obvious. I'm in Switzerland, so I drive on the right-hand side of the road. I'm in London, I drive on the left-hand side of the road. I'm in Naples, I ignore the traffic signs, follow the next follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision. Sorry, it has been studied. Italian drivers south of Naples flock. It's actually a flocking algorithm you need to apply. But the point is, what I'm doing here is sense, categorize, respond, and I apply best practice. If I get that wrong, I fall over the edge into chaos. So if, for example, I say, you must drive on the left regardless, and a bunch of school children run around the road in front of you, and you still drive on the left and they die, that's ridiculous. Remember when I worked for IBM, and IBM was quite a shock, yeah? The first thing they did when they took us over was to charge us for coffee and ban alcohol. The coffee-alcohol cycle is critical to good software development, and they didn't understand it, all right? Nobody should be expected to talk with users without alcohol, all right? Certainly not after you've delivered. Well, users never want what you can prove they asked for. They always want something else instead, which actually should teach us something. Users don't understand what technology can do for them, so they don't know what to ask for. That's the big new, and that's where we've got to look at unarticulated needs and matching existing capabilities, but that's for another day. So basically, one of the nasty things IBM did is they banned us from buying food for staff. Yeah, and basically it was ridiculous, all right? I mean, 4 o'clock in the morning, what do you do if you've got a team and you've got to keep them awake? You buy them pizza, don't you? And because they banned it, the only way to get around it was to overtip London taxi drivers and get blank receipts, which could be filled out for pizza and Coke. So I gave an extended version of this story at Berlin at the Scrum Alliance conference. 3 people from IBM ran up to me, this is 20 years later, showed me their wallets full of blank receipts and said, we're still doing that, did you invent it? Yeah, if you over-constrain a system, people have to break the rules to get the job done. Yeah? And that at a micro level is a catastrophic failure. It's also a Kodak moment. It's where you're so certain what you're doing is right, you don't see novelty coming, going back to the earlier scheme. So that's the bad side of chaos. If I'm in a chaotic system, I act, sense, respond. And another thing is interesting, I always get novel practice. Nothing like a crisis for novelty, which actually we can work on. We then get a complicated domain. Here the relationship between cause and effect isn't self-evident, so we sense, analyze, respond, and we apply good practice. We have to analyze the situation because we can't immediately see what to do. Even once we have seen it, we need to allow variation in what we do. We can't impose one approach. We've got to allow some degree of variation. Difference between fixed constraints and governance constraints. In a complex world, so many things are interacting with so many other things. The only thing I can do is probe, sense, respond, and the critical thing to avoid Hawthorne effect is I do multiple small experiments in parallel. I don't do one thing to see if it's right. That's the critical difference. And practice here, to go back to that earlier word, is ex-active. What happens in this space is you repurpose existing things for novel purposes. Now, you've all done this. I've lost count of the number of things I've used to open beer bottles in hotel bars late at night when there isn't a bottle opener. You can be tremendously inventive under conditions of scarcity and stress, all right? So, we're all good at this. We all do it on a regular basis, yeah? Now, the latest version of Cynefin is liminal, so it has an additional line which goes like this. And that defines this space and this space. This space is forced evolution. That's where you deliberately remove all the constraints so you get rapid generation of novelty, but within a contained space. Yeah? And there's a whole body of methods for that. This area here this is where Scrum fits. It's a liminal state. It's a state of transition between the complex and the complicated. I've more or less got it right, but I'm going to go through a series of sprints to make sure I've understood it properly. And that's its value. What we need desperately are more techniques over here. That's where we're doing things like triarchs rather than pair programming techniques. We're doing RAD sessions in which you have a RAD session for 8 hours in one country. The result goes to another country, an 8-hour time difference. Start in London, go to Mumbai, go to California. When it comes back, it's been mutated so many times. And every time we've done that, the users turn around and say, I didn't know we could do that, please can I have it? You're radically introducing mutation in the system. That's also where we're now starting to work on unarticulated needs, which is where you gather continuous observational anecdotes from users over 3 months, and you look for cluster patterns in the way they interpret those anecdotes, and you give those to prototyping teams to build prototypes to test understanding. Technologists know what technology can do, but they need to work directly with the raw narratives. They don't want them interpreted by a systems analyst. My big disagreements with using story points as a control mechanism and epics is somebody else has reinterpreted the material to make it more structured. Now, I haven't got time to go into these, but there's a body of techniques developing within that space. The principal message of Cynefin, before I draw this to a close, Okay, I've lost that, so I'll have to redraw that for you, don't worry. A couple of key messages out of this. Sorry, these are the latest additions to the Snowden household. My life is not worth living anymore. They keep possessing my bags, all right? But they are charming. We're a cat household. And if you don't know it, cats have servants, dogs have masters, all right? This is the way around it is, right? The cats haven't forgotten we used to worship them, and they're waiting for us to get back to it. If I try to manage these in a structured way, it doesn't work, all right? My wife has bought designer beds for them. Matching designer beds, all right? They're sleeping on my leather satchel that I carry my iPad around with. I had to leave it for them in the kitchen because I daren't go back, right? This is reality. Reality is messy. Right? So let me just draw Cynefin again and talk a bit about organizational design, and then we'll come to a conclusion. Sorry, I've gone too far on that. So we draw Cynefin here. Teams here need to be less than 5. This is Miller's number. The human short-term memory is 7 plus or minus 2. Yeah, you can't hold more than 3 or 4 things in your mind at one time. The cognitive load of working with more than 3 or 4 people in a crisis is too high. Yeah, tight teams, deep trust. Yeah? Up here, it needs to be less than 15. 15 is the maximum number of people who can simultaneously trust each other. The number is roughly correlated with the size of the extended family in the society in which you grow up. It's an habituated pattern of trust learnt when you're very young. 150, Dunbar's number, is the number of acquaintance you can maintain. You can't know more than about 150 people in terms of understanding their capability. And you should probably knock that down to 70 because you've got a life outside work. More than 150, you get bureaucracy. Now I'm showing that as one of a series of slides I could draw, which basically say the context determines what you can do. Kanban, for example, the underlying concept of Kanban, work in progress, is universal, but the representation of Kanban is complicated. We've got to rethink the way we represent work in progress for the complex space, because the current representations are too structured. You see where I'm going with this? What we need is a multi-methods, multi-tool approach, not the consolidation of everybody's methods into a single approach. And that's the trouble with a lot of the things. Okay, so I need to finish. Final point I want to make is this. When we do a new building, we put up scaffolding. And when we've actually completed the building, we take the scaffolding away. IT people have forgotten about that. They get so obsessed with the scaffolding, they keep it in place. Yeah, the whole point about software, architectures, methods, and tools is it's scaffolding, it's not the end product. If you really design something well, it won't need the scaffolding kept in place. So the plea I'm making on this, right, is we need to reinvent Agile, but not reinvent Agile as another management fad with another set of abstract claims. We need to invent it in a new form of pragmatism, by which we recognize the value of waterfall, we recognize the value of time boxes which are longer than 2 weeks. There's nothing wrong with 3 months or 6 months. We recognize the value of Scrum, we recognize the value of Kanban. We start to develop novel methods for the complex space because none of the traditional ones work. And we define the input and output of those methods so we can combine them in novel ways. That way, we produce an organization which is resilient, and we need to start to focus on managing how things connect, not on what they are. You can make a far bigger difference faster by changing connections rather than changing individuals. And by the way, it's more ethical. And this is kind of like a final negative point. The minute somebody comes along to me and gives a list of characteristics of an agile person, then first of all, I think they're wrong. Secondly, I think they're deeply patronizing. And thirdly, they're very ineffective. Yeah? Nobody actually can manage or should manage what you are as a person, but they can legitimately manage how you interact with other people. And that's the big difference we need to start to make. And that means we need to recognize all sorts of qualities we're not looking at the moment. So there is a future for Agile, but the future is not less, it's not safe. The future is multiple methods which are context-aware and context-dependent and don't claim to be context-free. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dave.